Well, good morning, everybody. I think we should get started. First, a couple things. Happy New Year in the Chinese lunar calendar. I don't know how to say that in Chinese, but someone else later can share that with the group. On a very practical note, I think most of you have heard on the way in that our speaker, Vitaly Napadau, came down with some strong illness last night and texted me at 5:30 this morning and said, "Any chance you can give a talk instead?" But anyway, I hope he feels better. And if anyone would rather not be here, I would not be offended if you need to leave and get a better position at the Patriots parade or whatever it is you would do today. But I want to thank you all for coming this morning. I'm Peter Wayne. I'm the interim director and the director of research at the Osher Center. And I want to share some thoughts I've been thinking about related to mind-body research and creating a more embodied framework for that. Before I do that, I just want to disclose that in addition to being a researcher here, I have a Tai Chi school in the community, and the Harvard Medical School and partners and I maintain a strong firewall between my community-based practices and my research. So I think it's fair to say that everyone here would agree that the mind-body split that we attribute to Descartes, I think, and therefore that thinking is what creates who I am, is not really congruent with integrative medicine. I think we all agree that integrative medicine is more of a systems or ecological view of health, where not only do top-down processes like psychological distress affect the physical body, but also bottom-up processes, how we move, the shapes we make, and even visceral processes affect how we think and how we feel. That being said, I think so this is more of the ecological framework. That being said, I think one of the motivations for my talk today is that this sense of a subtle and sometimes not so subtle hanging on of top-down or brain rules body paradigm is really prevalent in our mind-body research. And there's less of an appreciation for what I would call the intelligence of the body as a whole. And with that, a more limited appreciation of body-based metrics of integrative health, how we move, and our whole body as opposed to just looking at the brain. And what's surprising to me is that this biased view or this strong perspective is highly prevalent in the mind-body community itself. So I, most summers, get to spend a week at what's called the Mind and Life Institute, Research Institute in Western Massachusetts. And it's a place where contemplative researchers, practitioners, scholars all get together and talk about their practices, what's the cutting edge research and this really rich dialogue. And interspersed with that dialogue is really nice practice. We meditate every morning. There's a full day of silence. There's yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, all sorts of things that keep us in the work while we talk about research and how it relates to that. And what strikes me is that in the years I've been there, and this is one of my colleagues, James Austin, he's a quite famous man who's written a series of books called Zen and the Brain, but this represents what typically happens there. I think in the years I've been there, I've never seen a picture of the human body below the brain. It's all about the brain. I think this sort of top-down bias perspective is captured nicely in this book by Guy Claxton, which is very readable, and I really recommend it. And he writes, and I'll just read a little quote from it, "My mind was not parachuted in to save and supervise some otherwise helpless concoction of dumb meat. No, it's just the other way around. My intelligent flesh has evolved, as part of its intelligence, strategies and capacities that I think of as my mind. I'm smart precisely because I am a body. I do not own it or inhabit it, but from it I arise." It's a subtle distinction. And I think that this perspective is particularly relevant to movement-based practices like Tai Chi and yoga, which really, I think, have evolved to integrate in a more ecological way this brain-body-mind connection. And so I think all of us know is that as we evolved from very, 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 very ancient relatives, these single-celled organisms that floated around in the ocean, They were just kind of floating around there waiting for particles of food to go by. And if they were lucky and something went by, a little flagella would sort of reach out and grab it, and they would eat it. But over time, through evolution and chance, these things started to move. And they started to move to find food, right? But they also moved to avoid being food. And with that moving, there's a whole bunch of rapid evolution. They had to develop coordination, multicellularity, biomechanical coordination, cross-systems integration, the evolution of a nervous system, and eventually into a brain. And in higher organisms, things like multitasking and planning to coordinate this movement towards and away from things. And so I think it's, as a Tai Chi practitioner, and a researcher, I think it's an appreciation of this rich mind-body matrix, so to speak, that shaped these practices. I mean, we're learning to move, connecting mind-body movement in a very integrated ecological way. And if we don't do that well in the martial arts, there's natural selection. You get beat up and you lose, right? So there's a lot driving the system to coordinate that, not just the brain. So with that sort of perspective, while I appreciate the immense value of very precise measures that you can make with the brain, right, or any other organ system under highly controlled conditions, I think integrated measures that include the whole body, including how we move, right, and especially how we move in our natural environment. What the ethologists in the early part of the 1900s said, studying the organism in their environment, is a really important way to understand the impacts of integrated therapies on health, not just the pieces, but how the whole system moves in the real world. And it's an area that I don't think has been studied very much. So with that framework, what I wanted to do today is just say a few things about some of the areas of my lab's research, particularly Tai Chi and Qigong, just as exemplars of movement-based embodied practices. Sop Beer's here, and he does yoga, and I think many of the things I'll talk about here are quite related. And how I think these practices have evolved as multimodal therapies to connect these different systems and create a functional whole. Okay. Then I want to talk a little bit about gait and how we move in the world as a really lovely way of an integrated measure of whole person health. And then say a few things about some of the work we've done on Tai Chi and Qigong, on how it connects these different parts of the system, in particular, the thinking, cognitive part that coordinates with motor, and also the affective part, the emotion and movement, and how Tai Chi and yoga and various mind-body practices help regulate and enhance the integrated function of the system. And then talk a little bit about how technology today is allowing us to observe this in ecologically valid ways out in the field with sensors and wearable technology. So, good morning. Hey, Albert. So I think it's good to start with a definition, just in case some of you are not familiar, but most of you probably are. But we all know that Tai Chi is a mind-body practice. It's rooted in a lot of traditions from the East, including the martial arts, philosophy, and Chinese medicine. And the goal of this, and I think in the spirit of the setup, is that it's intending to integrate movement, slow, continuous, predictable movement with a lot of cognitive processes, top-down processes, and in particular, mental focus, heightened body awareness, imagery, visualization. And the goal overall is to strengthen and integrate the body and the mind, improve health, personal awareness, and in some practical ways, self-defense. This cartoon here sort of gives you an idea of the sort of ecological nature of this intervention and how it's really multimodal. It's like a multi-drug intervention. When we study things like aspirin, we take this isolated active ingredient, salicylic acid, and through laboratory work, we start to target very specific receptors, all right? And that goes into the system and shifts it. Here we have many, many potential active ingredients. We've got activity that strengthens the lower extremities. It's a weight-bearing exercise. It develops strength, flexibility. We're coordinating how that movement happens through trained, repeated exercise. There's a lot of top-down focus on relaxation, mindfulness. It's essentially Tai Chi is like a mindfulness on wheels kind of exercise. You're paying attention to each moment. There's a lot of placebo involved. We're using imagery. We're saying flow like water, float like clouds. And those suggestions we know change our motor and cognitive and affective systems. There's breathing going on. All these things happen within the context of groups, which we know feedback very strongly on the health. And there's even philosophy in there, like maybe doing a little less can give you more. So there's very rich things going on here, which goes into the system very differently than an isolated active ingredient in a pharmacological model, right? You get that? And this next slide gives you a sense of how it would shift the system for a particular clinical outcome. In this case, for example, falls, and I'll say some more about falls as we go along. But these are all different factors that good randomized trials have shown Tai Chi to be helpful for. So we know that when your muscles are weak, you're more likely to fall, and Tai Chi has been shown to increase strength. Let me get this cursor to work. Flexibility, rigidity, inability for the ankles to adapt to a surface, right? We've seen that. Proprioception, I'll show you some slides later. But we've seen over time in diabetic neuropathy and other areas that the sensation in the soles of the feet change over time. And if those change, then we have more sense of where we are in our body, and the neuromuscular system can adapt more. Once we start losing sensation, we have less information about the environment and how to react to it. Right. Reflexes. There's some really cool, wicked studies of people on treadmills wearing harnesses, and the treadmill will shift while they're walking. And people who've done Tai Chi for a period of time both react more smartly, the sequence of firing of muscles to adapt to that, as well as quickly. So there's the integration of the system. I'll say some more as we go along about anxiety, but fall-related anxiety is really important. Executive function I'll say some more about. But you get the idea. This is really the key point here, is that we're taking these ecological interventions, we're thinking of the person as an ecosystem, and we're trying to shift that. And I think that makes me want to not just study the little pieces, but how does the whole adapt? Okay. And so one of the ways I'm getting more interested in studying how the whole adapts is how we walk, and especially how we walk when we're not on a treadmill in the laboratory. Right? And I think it's something I'm moving towards believing is a really nice embodied measure of health. And there's good data to support that. This is from very large-scale epidemiological and prospective studies, but we know that walking speed, especially in older adults, predicts all-cause mortality, lower quality of life, increased risk of falls, progression of cardiometabolic diseases like diabetes, heart failure, and even dementia, and I'll show some work on that. So just how you walk as an older adult is predictive of and correlated with these conditions. Those are multi-system conditions often. Another measure that we're getting interested in is not just speed, but the quality, the rhythmicity of how you walk, what's called stride time variability. There's many different metrics, but if someone is walking with an easy gait, they just look like things are moving well. If they have perturbance in this timing, and the extreme of that you can think of as freezing of gait and Parkinsons, that's a sign of poor gait health and poor integration across the systems. And there's quite a bit of research on that, and we've been using that as a metric for some of our work. And we've seen that, and others have seen that, even in Parkinson's disease that's prodromal, so someone with Parkinson's disease would come into to see a physician, a neurologist, and there are no symptoms, but they're a carrier of, let's say, the LRRK2 gene that predisposes them to that. If we ask them to walk while they're doing a cognitive challenge like counting backwards, we start to see perturbance in this cognitive motor system. Very sensitive, even before there are obvious symptoms. So that's been a helpful tool for our research, associated with depression and other things as well. And we've been doing some other work on long-term walking dynamics. I won't go into that now, but there's a rich body of work, and Jan Maas here, who does a lot of work in fractal and nonlinear dynamics, and Charles Coey as well. But they've been applying these tools to understanding physiological systems. And encoded in these long-term dynamics is some measures of integrative health as well. Okay. But there's no one measure of movement and gait that's good. Each one sort of gives you a little window into a different dimension of health. So we've been exploring different ones. These are some examples of what we've learned in terms of the very simple question of, does walking speed correlate with overall health in different conditions? These first two are from Gloria Ye, who just came in, one of my colleagues in research here, and some of the earliest work was with systolic heart failure. This is a simple randomized trial done here, 12 weeks of Tai Chi added to the usual care that people receive at these Harvard hospitals. After 12 weeks, there was quite an alarming decline in the walking health of these people with heart failure. These are very sick people. I think in that study, some of them were like class 3 and 4 American heart failure, so they were waiting for a heart transplant. And those who did 12 weeks of Tai Chi improved in their gait speed. So very simple measure of overall health. This was a study in diastolic heart failure, and instead of comparing it to usual care, we compared the Tai Chi group to people doing aerobics. So 12 weeks of aerobics with music, and then we had to put music in our Tai Chi group, so 12 weeks of Tai Chi music and Tai Chi. And what we found was, even though during the aerobics class, and we measured them during their activity, their heart rate was much higher, their oxygen uptake dynamics was much more activated. After 12 weeks, those in the Tai Chi group still walked a greater distance over time, greater walking speed than those in the control group. So we don't know what the mechanisms are, but something's going on there. And it's not just one system, that clearly the aerobic system, that's playing a role here. And this is some work by Fuzhong Li in Parkinson's disease. And again, compared to an active stretching group, and I think this is active stretching, the people who did Tai Chi walked faster. So it seems to be a useful measure to capture overall function. Okay. I will say, though, that it's not the case in all studies. This is what makes it kind of interesting. Some of the best studies that show that Tai Chi can reduce fall rates, in this case by Stephen Wolf, showed that about a 43% reduction in risk of falls, which is profound. The people actually walk slower after doing Tai Chi. So somehow they're on this, we don't understand this fully, but it might be, hey man, what's the rush? Let's smell the flowers along the way. So one measure of how people move may not be suitable to understand health in all dimensions. We can drill a little deeper, as I mentioned before, into this. Why are people walking slower or faster? This is some work by one of our postdocs who's now assistant professor at the Institute for Aging Research, Brad Manner. This is a small study in peripheral neuropathy, diabetic-related peripheral neuropathy. And what you can see is this is before and after 24 weeks of Tai Chi. And just very simple filament tests to see how sensitive the plantar sensation is, proprioception in the soles of the feet. And after 24 weeks, you can see that in all of these sites, there's a significant improvement in the ability of the soles of the feet to detect things, right? And what's important in this case is that the improvement, magnitude of improvement in that plantar sensation is correlated with their improvement in walking speed. So we could drill a little deeper and go, what systems are involved specifically in enhancing this function? Yeah? Okay. So I want to just shift now, not just overall function, but this cognitive motor function that I think really underlies why we call it mind-body practices, right? But some people are still just studying the brain. I think there's more to study. There's a good literature out there that shows, and I'll unpack a little bit of this, and it doesn't come from integrative medicine, it just comes from good aging research, that how we move affects how we think, and how we think affects how we move. And that's sort of where I'm going to focus in the next couple minutes. This is a construct called the motor cognitive risk syndrome, and it's a very simple construct that clinicians can use in their practice. And they ask two questions. can you walk? And with a stopwatch, they can gauge walking speed. And then they ask a simple question, in the past couple weeks, do you feel like you've had some deficits in your memory? That's it. No like 40 instrument questionnaires or anything, just 2 questions, right? And this is a survivorship curve over 12 years of a good cohort. This is not a small sample. This is nearly 27,000 people pooled from different studies. And it asks for people who have no signs of dementia at baseline at year 0, over these 12 years, what's the risk? What proportion of people develop dementia? You get that, right? So this top line are people who told their doctors, I don't have any concerns with my memory, and they had a normal walking speed for their age. Right? There's some standard walking speeds you can look at. And you can see they had the lowest risk of developing dementia. This next line are people who said, I do have some cognitive complaints. And they had about a 10 or so percent increase in dementia. What's interesting to me is that people who had no cognitive complaints but just walked a little slower had actually twice the risk or more of developing dementia. So how they moved was a better predictor than what they were thinking of as to whether or not they're going to have dementia or Alzheimer's 10 years out or 12 years out. And of course, those who had both had the highest risk. You follow that? That's intriguing to me. I won't say much about this, but there is some good data out there. This is a dated systematic review that supports that doing these movements actually preserves or enhances your cognitive function. There's some meta-analyses. There's a lot more research that's come out recently, and Jiang Kong is going to be presenting some work on neuroimaging and Qigong, and some of it's going to be related to cognitive function later on, I think in June, in our seminar series here. But there's some data, especially in terms of executive function in healthy people, and there's been a couple trials, more since this review was published, on people with mild cognitive impairment. So even people who have initial impairments in cognition, some of that cognitive function can be preserved. One of the areas we're particularly interested in is executive function. And so executive function is like what it sounds like. It's the executive of your thinking. It's you over here. No, less of that, more of this. It allows you to do macro management, task shifting, things like that, coordination, goal planning, right? Very important for how we move through life, literally and metaphorically. There's really good research out there that shows that people with intact cognitive function, in other words, there's no memory issues, they have normal mini-mental scores, all the other tasks, except that they have some small or moderate deficits in executive function. That alone, when you control for muscle strength, smoking, lifestyle, predicts a 44% increased likelihood of falling. So just your ability to pay attention when everything else is controlled for. So top affects the bottom, right? So we've been exploring this in our work, and we could do this with what's called a dual task paradigm. And we simply just, and this really mimics what happens in the world. You don't just, very few people are free enough to walk out in nature and not think. You're thinking about something that's very different than where you are in the moment. This is what mindfulness is trying to teach us. But you're either having a conversation with someone, you're looking up and down the shelves of the supermarket, you're thinking about how, someone really annoyed you the day before. You're not there. And so we need to be able to shift attention. And so the question is, if we're being distracted by something, is there a cost to that in how we move? And the short answer is very much so. This is some simple work done by Jeff Hausdorff, one of our colleagues that we work with, based in Tel Aviv. And this is gait speed here, and these are no dual tasks. These are phenomes, like tell me all the vegetables that begin with the letter R, and you have to go, rutabaga, no, etc. And so that's distracting. Then you get more complex and you say count backwards by 3s from 216, or count backwards by 7s. And the more challenging this task, the slower people walk. Right? And then the other piece is the variability. The more complex the task, the less rhythmicity there is. So we know that this is a good paradigm for studying movement. Okay, and so what we want to know, and this is a woman in our lab, one of our studies, is if we bring them into the lab, this woman's close to 80. On the top, she's walking without a dual task. The bottom with, you can see she's walking faster. And then when she turns the bend on the slide, you'll see not only is she walking faster, but look at the quality of the spacing between the steps. In the top, there's sort of equal spacing, sort of a nice rhythm. In the bottom, it's less regular. And really what drives some of our research is if this woman is taught Tai Chi while she's doing a dual task, can she walk more like this? Right? Will the bottom one look more like the top after training? Got it? And the short answer is very much so, yes. This is, again, some work by Brad Manor in our group. This is a study that was quite elderly, frail people. These are not spring chickens. The average age in this group was 85 years old, so it's never too late to start Tai Chi. Some were over 90, number were over 90. A few of them turned 100 during our study, which was fantastic. And what you can see is while they were being tasked by counting backwards by 3, after 12 weeks of Tai Chi, there was an improvement in gait speed. We can also look at variability. This is a different study. This is a study comparing healthy older adults between 50 and 80. And these are really healthy because we recruited them with no use of pretty much any meds. And it's really hard to find 80-year-old people who aren't doing too many medications. So it's a very unique group of people. Most of them were very active. The first part of the study was to take 60 very healthy people and compare them to 30 Tai Chi experts in the Boston area. And by experts, we recruited what we call Tai Chi masters. Their average experience in Tai Chi was about 25 years of training. If we were going to see an effective Tai Chi, we better see it in this group. So this is our gold standard reference. And what we see is that the Tai Chi experts during a complex dual task have much better dual task variability, lower variability than those who are the healthy controls. Right? And then we could take the healthy controls, the 60, and divide them into 2 groups in a small randomized trial for 6 months and ask, do they start to move in the same direction of outcomes as those that the experts themselves? And we see the same effect here, lower dual task variability after 6 months of training in what was originally Tai Chi naive people. So you get that? So Tai Chi seems to allow this toggling between top down and bottom up to preserve good cognitive motor function during a task that simulates what happens in the real world. And we've done the same paradigm in Parkinson's disease. This came out this last year, but we see a nice trend towards the same improvement. And in Parkinson's disease, maybe this is even more important. Maybe Parkinson's can be thought of in this case as an exaggerated form of aging, but with Parkinson's and to some degree with aging, the automaticity of movement, the ability to just move, is really decreased by loss of dopamine, right? But people with Parkinson's and people who age and lose dopamine can compensate by paying more attention. So they become very vigilant. They recruit a lot of cortical activity to maintain good gait. But if we take that away, we see the impairment pretty strongly if we take that attention away by making them count. And part of our hypothesis is that Tai Chi is good for Parkinson's. It's been shown to reduce falls and do a lot of things because of this cognitive motor training that may enhance the ability to recruit these other areas. You get that? So it's another systems example. And again, we can drill down a little bit deeper into the mechanisms of why gait rhythmicity might be better. This is actually Jan Ma's work, who's here. We're just about ready to punt this paper off. It's still finishing up. But what we found is this synergy, this sort of dynamic synergy in the lower limbs, the gastrocs and the tibialis anterior, they should sort of move in and out of phase as you're walking. One fires, one releases, one releases, one fires. And when gait is not steady, there's co-contraction. And so what we've learned is that Tai Chi reduces co-contraction, and to some degree there's a trend of dual tasking exaggerating that co-contraction. So we're seeing that this might be one of the mechanisms for improving rhythmic gait. I want to just see if I can get this to work, but I want to shift now to not just attention part of cognition, but the sort of more affective part. And gait is a way of looking at emotion, okay? And I hope this will work if I can. This is some work from a lab in New Brunswick. It's a really elegant set of studies. And this is a person. These are little infrared sensors put on a real person, right? And this is a composite of many, many people. I think there's a couple, close to 1,000 people in this database now. And what they've been able to show is that they can capture emotion and they can retrain movement based on emotion, right? So this toggle here, and this is all based on, this is a person becoming sadder. And this is that same cohort becoming happier. Right? This is someone relaxed. This is someone a little nervous. Right? You get the idea? So embedded in how we move, you don't need to see the whole person. You don't need to ask them questions. You don't need to look at their brain. There's information there. And I think most clinicians, when someone comes in, they're like, I already know where I'm going, whether it's a manual therapist or a psychotherapist or a primary care doc. It's like, oh, you're having one of those weeks, or something's happened since I last saw you. Oh, things are good. But you can read a lot. And in Chinese medicine, body posture is part of the interrogation, as they say. Okay, so let me see if I can get out of here. So there's some really lovely work done in this lab, and they can generate those by playing sad music or happy music or having people recall certain experiences, and it changes their posture while they're moving. There's cross-sectional stuff. People with major depressive disorder move very differently than people who are psychologically in better condition. And then there's some really clever experiments. I'll try to explain it very quickly. And Camilla, I don't know if she's here, but she's helped pull some of this research together, and we've done some reviews on this. But they ask people while they're walking on a treadmill, all right, to just look at a toggle. Just like, and the idea is, we're not going to tell you what this experiment's about. We're not even going to tell you what we're trying to get you to do. But see if you can just keep moving and move the dial this way, or move the dial this way, right? So someone's walking and the dial goes this way, and they just start doing things, right, that moves the dial this way. And they were able to get people to move the dial all the way this way pretty well, and all the way this way. All the way this way is being more sad. All the way this way is being more happy, in terms of looking like other people in their database. So you're just mimicking, but you don't even see dots. You're just doing this. Before the experiment, they ask them to recall a series of questions in experimental psychology, like recall as many of these words as you can. If they've done sad walking, they recall sad words in a different way than if they've done happy walking. So by changing how people move, we change their psychology, even in the short term. And there's a lot of short-term experiments where you can have people push up on the table, which is really different than pushing down on the table. You can ask people to watch movies like this, and the half-life of the sadness of the movie is very different than if you watch it like this. There's studies where they put a pencil in your mouth, which makes you smile, and that changes your neurochemistry and your emotion. A lot of short-term experiments that show that facial expressions and overall posture changes your affect. Very, very few long-term experiments. I'll come back to that in a second. But one of the ways that plays out here is fear of falling. If you've ever watched an elderly person who's had an experience of a fall, they carry themselves in a very different way. There's a guarding, there's a holding of the breath, there's an uncertainty about the environment. And ironically, fear of falling is one of the biggest predictors of a subsequent fall. Right? People start feeling less confident, they exercise less, they go out less, they socialize less. It becomes a vicious cycle. There's some really nice data out there. Just to drive home the point, fear of falling predicts slower gait speed and more variability, not surprising. And then there's some really nice data out there showing that Tai Chi, one of the ways it improves postural control and balance is through this psychological mechanism. The meta-analyses out there suggest about close to a 40% improvement in this construct. There's really good measures out there, psychometrically sound measures of fear of falling. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we're changing the system, is through this affective piece. So the last couple slides I want to show is sort of some work in a new direction that we're going in about posture. I had the opportunity, I was really lucky as a graduate student on the other side of the river in evolutionary biology to be a teaching assistant to Professor E.O. Wilson, Mr. Sociobiology, Mr. Anth, amazing guy, just incredible person. And in his last general lecture on evolution for non-majors, he showed this slide, a slide like this of all these different primate species. And he talked about the evolution of body language. And basically he showed all these different gestures of different species. And he concluded, he's like, it's very hard to be sad in this shape. And it hit me. This is 1988. And I had moved here to do my PhD. I started my Tai Chi school. I've been doing Tai Chi for a number of years at that point. And I was like, oh my God, this is part of why we have these postures in Tai Chi. I never thought of it. We're not told to be like this. We're not told to be like this. But being like this, regardless of how you breathe, what you think, your movement changes you. There's a hardwiring implicit in the way these systems evolved. And one can imagine, the cobra pose and the downward dog, all of those really affect us in very profound ways. Some of you were here for Amy Cuddy's talk about a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, and she's popularized some of these power poses, some provocative research. Some of it's been replicated, some of it needs to be explored further, but simple things. One of her first studies, which was replicated, is you have people in these alpha positions. They're getting together for a job interview or having a conversation. One person's sitting like this, or they got their feet up on the table, so like the alpha chimp, or the other person is in a more submissive position. And she didn't tell them what they were doing this for. Just do this. What happens is, at the end of those discussions, depending on how you sit, the outcome of the arbitration differs. Those in a more alpha position felt better about the interview, did better in the conversation. But she also had the wherewithal to measure endocrine function. So she measured testosterone and cortisol. And what she found was that just sitting like this for a couple minutes in this alpha position generated more testosterone. Sitting like this created more stress, cortisol. So just the shapes we take in a short period of time can change our systems and change how we interact socially, right? She's also done some nice work where they just have people stand like this for a while, just feel good, right? And then they go for a job interview. And basically, they're professional interviewees. They don't know. People are randomized to have done something prior to the intervention, do that or not do that. And they record the whole thing, video, right? And what they found was that the young women in this study who prepared themselves for a few minutes beforehand actually did much better. They passed the job interview with higher scores than the people who didn't. And when they asked the people on the side what was going on there, the judges, it had nothing to do with verbal content. It all had to do with body carriage, how they carried themselves. So some really rich stuff in there. We've done a systematic review on this. Like I said before, there's a lot of short-term experimental work showing these relationships, but very few longitudinal studies. We've done one that we've just finished up and we've submitted. This is led by Camilla Sippy in our lab, and this is a really nice model to study this. These are women with a very complex polymorbid condition. It's persistent post-mastectomy pain. They've been diagnosed with cancer, so they have the fear of recurrence. This is a plug for Daniel's talk next month. They've been through radiation, they've been through chemotherapy, they have a lot of fatigue, distress, those sorts of things. And after mastectomy and changing their self-image, they have chronic pain. And so the doctors would typically say, oh, go to a physical therapist. That will fix that. And our sense is, wow, this pain is really complicated. It's really a rich ecological dysfunction. So we get in there with what we call Qigong exercise. It's a 12-week program. Women are taught to do some beautiful stretching exercises while they're breathing. They're doing affirmations. They're talking to each other. It's done in a circle with a really nice teacher. We're shifting the whole system. And in short, we hit a home run with this. This is a small, uncontrolled study, so it's just preliminary. But in terms of clinical outcomes, we see really nice changes in reductions in pain severity and how it interfered with their life, changes in anxiety and their mood. So multiple systems here. This is a beautiful instrument. If you haven't used it, it's called Maya, the Multidimensional Assessment of Interoceptive Awareness, developed by Wolf Mailing. And it asks these questions like the body construct is, when I'm upset, I take time to explore how my body feels. It's how these women understood where in their whole body system things were shifting. Or trust, I feel my body is in a safe place. And by and large, for all of these constructs, there's a few of them, this is just two, they improve their quality of interoceptive awareness and at ease. Right? And then the cool thing about this is we brought them into the laboratory, we made measurements of their posture, and in short, our preliminary data suggests that over time, just doing this for 12 weeks, the head angle, how they carried themselves, improved, and that improvement was correlated with their improvements in depression scores. So we see this mind-body connection. So I don't have much time here. I just want to say that this is what's at the heart of these practices. I was developing this talk. We were at Esalen, and I was in a room, and this is where Suzuki wrote his stuff, Zen Mind, Beginner Mind, one of the most famous books. And I opened up the first page, and I was like, oh my God, this is the first thing he said. He said, these, and it was about posture instruction. These forms are not a means of obtaining a right state of mind. To take this posture itself is to have the right state of mind. Right? So you see that it's implicit in these trainings. We're doing a lot of work here. Helen's done some work. She's moved on now. But stretching, there are ways of exploring this. How does connective tissue change this whole system? There's some work we've been doing with Karolinska. We can inject people with things that give them a really horrible flu, this inflammatory cascade, and having a flu changes how you walk. Makes you look older and more likely to fall. One of the coolest things is that starting next week, we're going to have a gait system in our clinic at the Osher Center. And our goal is, I'm here to see Dr. Levy or Dr. Kowalski. Great, can you walk along this mat? And it automatically collects all this information of gait, rhythmicity, and speed. They go see their therapist, they get treated, they come out, please walk this way. And we start to collect this database and start to more systematically explore the relationship of gait as a integrated measure of health and what parts of the systems are shifting. And even if you don't think this is important, and this will bring us back to what Vitali would have been emphasizing in the brain, this is a study of MEG, magnetic encephalography, and almost all MRI studies are done laying down, right? That's the way the machine, you go in a tunnel and you do this, right? But MEG you can do sitting up. And so this looks like back in the day when my mom went to the hairdresser, but they did the same image while they were sitting up, semi-supine, and then laying down, and you get completely different brain images of the same person depending on what posture they're in. So even if you don't think this is important, you need to check your bias. So in summary, I think gait and postural control can be an informative, practical measure of health across all sorts of populations and medical conditions. I think the integrated nature of these outcomes make them particularly well suited for these multimodal integrative therapies like mind-body practices. But I'd say the same goes for chiropractic and massage and yoga and other ones. These therapies are designed to get into the ecosystem and shift their crosstalk. And I think these holistic measures of movement capture the whole system in a nice way. There's a lot of ways to probe this. I won't say too much about this, but we really need to take a translational approach, looking at it from the top down, but as well as the bottom up with mechanisms. And I think the technology that's out there, whether it's a gait mat or wearable sensors, really is a ripe time to explore this more ecological approach to health. Most of this work involves a lot of collaboration with a lot of smart, generous people. I've just been a small part of that, helping herd the cats on our teams. So I want to thank them, but there's not enough time to do that in detail. I want to thank the Osher Center and NIH for support, and thank you guys for listening and for tolerating me pitch hitting today. So sorry we didn't get to hear Vitali, because that would have been a great talk, but hopefully we'll get him back soon. So thank you. How are we doing for time? Oh, good. Yeah, I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you. That was very nice. While I was listening, I had one question kept coming up. What if we could also compare yoga? What if we could also compare tapping? What if we could also compare other kinds of mind-body interventions? And where do all these things fall on your assessments of gait and posture and healthy living?
As I said, I think any therapy, for the most part, if you unsquint, is holistic. Even is holistic in the sense that it targets multiple systems. I think a good pharmacologist, someone who's going to give you an antidepressant, will bring to that a lot of context. That's not just changing the chemistry of your body, but your expectations, your hopes, and, so everything is shifting the whole system. You go in to a good primary care doctor and they know your number, you just feel at ease being with them because they're listening to you. So whether it's tapping, whether it's yoga, whether it's just the best of primary care, we're changing the whole system. And therefore, how we move, my guess is that an anxious person that's worried about something who sees a good doctor that listens to their distress, and I'm thinking about our clinical director up there who's interested in treating the whole person and not just their symptoms, they walk out of his office feeling very different. And we could see that if we measured it. I've seen people walk out of his neighbor's office who get Feldenkrais, a lovely man who has Parkinson's and is treated. And whenever he comes out, he literally says, because I see him in the hallway, "How am I walking?" It's not just because he's been fixed, but because he's been inspired. So I think we can apply this across the board.
Hi, good morning. So I'm a yoga teacher, and given the answer to this last question, that every holistic intervention can have benefit, I'm really curious about the particular benefit of weight bearing, and as that relates to walking, but also to the healthy, the mind-body improvement of health and emotional health, and that's a very strong characteristic of Tai Chi. In yoga, we do, part of it is standing postures, and part of it is more reclined postures, or different kinds of weight bearing. So I'm wondering how we can get into that.
Yeah.
And when you look at things like gait and Parkinson's, is there a particular benefit from doing weight bearing work?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think two things. I think there's weight bearing, and then there's verticality. I think the weight bearing itself has a physiological effect on lower extremity muscles and things like that. But just standing and being in this way of being on the ground and moving is different than sitting or doing a downward dog.
Yeah.
Not just because of the musculature, but because of the functionality of it. And I think those are separate. Tai Chi evolved as a martial art. It's very practical. It's not this. And that's good too. I'm not saying better or worse. And so in that sense, I think my guess is, even though there's very few back-to-back studies, that on average, doing training in Tai Chi is going to be better for fall prevention, where you're walking around in the world and dealing with things, than seated meditation and yoga, or certain types of yoga. Again, there's a lot of pluralism. But I think there's also something different beyond just the neuromuscular function. And there's, we do a lot of standing meditation. And it's really different to meditate or just be still while you're standing than while you're sitting or laying down. And I think we saw that in the last image of the Meg. Something's happening, regardless of, training muscles and bones. But I think we evolved from 4 legs to 2. It wasn't a really well-designed shift. It's remarkable, but we've evolved to be moving around on 2 feet. And so I think practices that are designed to be done while you're standing versus sitting or in other postures might really affect us in different ways. And I can't say more than that right now, but I think about that a lot. One of the founders of our lineage of Tai Chi said, and this is just more flip, he would say, yoga and he would say meditation. Sitting meditation is really good, like Tai Chi. But if you do Tai Chi, they won't be able to knock you off your pillow. But that's more the functionality piece. But it's a really profound thing. What's it mean to be upright? For example, yeah, and I think there are different emotions in these different shapes and different affects and different physiologies.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
All right, thank you.
Hi, this is really more just a comment on our evolution and perhaps a concern about it. I mean, if you think about the youth of today and their cell phones and the posture that goes along with it, the hunching over and just that constant
Yeah,
lack of
eye back it's called. It's a new phrase for it.
So as these people grow and, their heart space is so constricted, where are we going? The verticality of all of it.
Well, I agree. I think that, and just the way you framed your observation, we're not just concerned about their spine. We're concerned about how it impacts I have a family member who's in bed now because her severe scoliosis is impacting her lung function. And it's inflamed and she's on steroids. And so form impacts function, but we also know, as you're saying, you're talking about the heart maybe physically and metaphorically. You're a very different person when you're in here and not out here. I think it just speaks to our desire to shift the whole system and to not just look at the parts. Yeah. Charles.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering a little bit more about the dual task paradigm. And I think if I understood you, the way that you phrased it is after this Tai Chi training, you're more able to recruit those cognitive resources to help stabilize your gait. And I'm wondering if you considered alternative ideas about the Tai Chi just enabling more automatic movement, or if it's a cognitive motor integration issue. It seems like there's so much there. And
it really is. And you're absolutely right. I don't know what the mechanism is. I do understand from reading the literature now, my understanding is we can't do two things at the same time. We can't multitask. What we can do is get really more and more seamless about shifting back and forth. So what I mean there is that we get more seamless about being able to tend to one thing while something else is going on. Maybe it's not even toggling, but maybe, like you said, maybe we just get so good at this that we could do that without really allocating as much energy and distracted resources to that. There's a trade-off, and depends on if you're an older person or a younger person. Some people will walk no matter what, and they don't care if they get the counting wrong. So the other side of this dual task is how well do you do in your cognitive function? My guess is that if we did this with, Harvard professors, they'd fall just to get the counting right or something like that. I don't know. So that this is a bottom-up perspective just because I was focusing on gait. But there's also that piece too. And there's some interesting studies out there that show that certain groups will pay more attention to the counting and the cognitive task at the expense of this, and that's interesting too. But I don't know what the mechanisms are. We are starting to see now. Let's see if I can get this right. Amy Lowe at Hebrew Senior Life, we have some of her own data, but she's done some other stuff, that the neural networks of the brain that are associated with healthy walking speed are very different than the neural networks that are associated with dual task gait variability. And in the latter one, this is really weird, but you've got this dorsal attention network, the DAN, which is like sustained attention, so it's ability to focus. And then you've got this default mode network, which is mind wandering. And what they found is that it's that network, that shift between attention and mind wandering, that shifts mostly in the dual task paradigms, and other networks are the ones that are more regulated with speed. So people can start to maybe explore your question with some neural data as to which processes are being influenced before and after training. I think that would be an interesting way to explore that.
Thank you.
Don, up behind you? Yeah. Uh-oh.
I'm just wondering, since we've had some sports lately, have you thought of looking at athletes? Like, I was thinking more of basketball. Someone is
Yeah.
dribbling the ball, that's two
Yeah.
things, and moving, and looking at the whole court and somehow find somebody under the hoop
Yeah.
who sends it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And what is there anything that could be gained in helping train an athlete?
Yeah.
First of all, you become very rich. If you figure this one out.
So I had this discussion last night with one of my students. We have a teacher training program, and as a part of the 2-year graduation, they have to give an academic talk. And he's a trainer, and he wanted to do something on cross-training and Tai Chi for athletes. And he trains goalies. And they do things like they have these ping pong ball machines, and they fire them at these goalies, and they only have to catch the red ones, the little red ping pong balls. So they have to discriminate. In experimental psychology, this is like a go, no-go task, right? And there's one study of sword play, people who've learned Tai Chi sword, done by William Tsang in Hong Kong. And they have a screen, and on the screen is a red dot or a green dot, and they come up at random times in random places. And only when it's green do you want to touch it. And only when it's red, you want to be inhibited. So they can tell, and so they looked at people who've been doing this a lot as a framework versus those who didn't do it. And those who did Tai Chi were more accurate in doing the red ones versus the green ones. They were faster because they had EMG and they can see exactly when they launched. And they were also more precise because they touched the screen in the right spot. And so there's very little data on this, but one would predict that some of this cognitive motive piece, and it's out there anecdotally, Tiger Woods, grew up doing some Qigong, Michael Jordan, some of our chief, I think, Barbara Parrish, he would do Tai Chi, smoke a little weed as well. But anyway, they all did Tai Chi here, and they would fight. They actually went to fighting Tai Chi schools here in Boston. And so people have talked about the value to cross-training. It's a really good question. And if you look at a lot of the paradigms out there for high-level athletes, at some point, most of it is what they call mind. The inner guide to golf, the inner tennis, the inner skier. There's stuff on neuro-linguistic programming and where the skier visualizes every turn of the course and feels it in their body. And where they can't feel it, that's where they have to sort of work it. So there's clearly a lot of top-down, bottom-up processes going on. But it hasn't been studied a lot. But it's a good idea for bringing funds into the Osher Center. Yeah. I think we're being thrown out. But thank you for sticking with us. I want to say that next month, on March 5th, Daniel Hall, one of our T32 fellows, is going to be doing a clinical case series, clinical rounds. We alternate every month, as you know, between a clinical case and a more research-oriented case talk, and it's entitled "Taming the Fear of the Recurrence Monster in Cancer: Mind-Body Skills." And Daniel's really at the forefront of this very challenging issue that's not just related to cancer, but anyone who's worried about mortality. It's like, oh yeah, that's going to happen, and how do we manage that? What we call in my family on-the-way feelings. And then Jiang Kong is going to talk in April on brain plasticity associated with Tai Chi. There's a list out there. There's some refreshments and snacks and an opportunity for us to chat outside. I hope you can stick around and join us. And there's also announcements for those of you who are in the acupuncture community, or just public health in general, of our conference that we're co-sponsoring in Burlington in June, with the Society for Acupuncture Research. But it's really coming together beautifully. And at this point, we have a tentative acceptance from Bernie Sanders to come. And we have representatives from Blue Cross Blue Shield, the VA. So we'll be integrating science and multiple stakeholders to talk about the case for acupuncture as a sort of a multimodal, part of multimodal healing. So take a look at that poster. All right. Thanks again, and I hope to see you guys next month.